The courthouse smelled faintly of lemon polish and wet coats, the kind of morning that makes marble floors slick and voices carry. I pushed open the heavy door, a 6-9-year-old grandmother in my best black suit, and the sound seemed to slice the low murmur in half. My daughter, Dawn, glanced over, rolled her eyes, and leaned toward her husband. I saw Dave's mouth curl around a whisper he didn't bother to hide, the kind that strips the name mother down to a stranger in an old woman's body. I took one step, then another. The benches were crowded, the air too warm, the overhead lights throwing a mean shine on polished wood. For a moment, I was just the woman with the tired handbag and the chipped wedding band, no different from a dozen others who'd come before me to swallow pride for the sake of family. A clerk rifled papers without looking up. The bailiff's jaw worked a piece of gum. Dawn's perfume, sharp, expensive, floated in the space between us like a barricade. Then the judge looked up. I watched it happen, the way his pen stilled mid-stroke, the pause that broke his face into recognition, the flicker of something like memory cutting through his professional calm. He removed his glasses. The tiniest breath left him, as if someone had knocked gently on the door of his chest. "It's her," he murmured. Silence rolled through the courtroom in a single clean wave. A cough died midway. The bailiff straightened. Even Dave's smirk stalled, suspended in mid-air like a lie that had lost its footing. My daughter's spine stiffened. She stared at the judge, then back at me, confusion beginning to gnaw at her certainty. In that hush, every heartbeat seemed suddenly audible mine, the clerk's, the unborn grandchild I had only learned about in a weaponized confession days earlier. I stood inside the quiet, as if it were a chapel. No one in that room knew me. Not really. To most of them, I was Maeve, the woman who brewed coffee at dawn in a chipped mug, who watered African violets because her late husband had loved them, the mother who worked nights and weekends and sewed hems, so her only daughter could have the future she once saw only on other people's faces. I was the woman too old for her house, too fragile for decisions, too sentimental to be trusted with the rooms she had paid for with her back and her time. I had been labeled, measured, appraised, but the judge remembered something else. His eyes softened with a recognition that did not belong to this morning, not to the legal motions stacked like bricks, not to the smugness of a son-in-law who thought deeds and diagnoses could be forged by tone. The judge's gaze crossed the well of the court and came to rest on me with the weight of a name he had not said in years. It landed like a hand on my shoulder, steady, human. Dawn shifted. Her bracelet chimed. "What is he talking about?" she whispered, but the words had none of their usual steel. Dave's fingers tightened on the edge of their bench. I could see him searching for the thread of control he pulled so easily in our living room, the one he used to yank my daughter's voice into his pocket. That thread didn't reach this far. Not here. "Counsel, approach," the judge said, but his eyes stayed with me a heartbeat longer, as if to anchor me in a present that was finally on my side. The attorneys rose, papers rasping, chairs scraped, and yet the room felt as though it hadn't moved at all, as though we were all fixed in place by a story that was about to be told whether anyone wanted to hear it or not. My legs trembled, old habit, not fear. For months I had been taught to doubt my balance. "You forgot the stove. You misplace your keys. You can't possibly manage alone." Their sentences were cages. I learned to stand very still. Now the bars were there and not there, visible and dissolving, because a single sentence from the bench had cracked them. "It's her." A clock on the back wall ticked impatient, impartial. The sound tethered me to the floor like a metronome for my courage. I breathed in the lemon polish, the paper dust, the cold that sneaks under doors no matter what season you tell yourself it island. My husband used to say that truth arrives quietly and sits down, and if you make a chair for it, it will stay. I had made chairs for everyone but myself for years. This morning, I pulled one out, and Saturday, Dawn turned fully at last. There was a tremor in her voice that had nothing to do with defiance. "Mom, what is going on?" I did not smile. I did not gloat. I let the question hang, braided with the judge's recognition and the scrape of lawyers' shoes at the bench. The past and the present were aligning in a place I had never expected to be seen. The clerk looked up, curiosity rinsing the indifference from her face. Dave's jaw worked. He chewed on the possibility that money and manipulation might not speak the court's language today. The judge put his glasses back on. "We'll proceed," he said. "Steady now." But everyone could feel the shift the way a storm breaks, not with thunder, but with the sudden clean scent that comes before it. The story they thought they were telling about me was about to lose its narrator. The trial would change everything. Not because of wealth, not because of power, not even because of what I had discovered tucked in a folder where grief thought it had hidden my future. It would change because the room itself now remembered me. And once a room remembers you, the truth has somewhere to sit. "Mrs. Williams," the judge said, voice even respectful, "thank you for being here." I inclined my head. For the first time in months, I did not feel like the defendant in my own life. Long before marble floors and whispered insults in courtrooms, my life had been made up of smaller, quieter battles. I was born into simplicity, and I lived in it most of my years, but my heart never complained. Each day was a mosaic of routines stitched together with love. Love for my husband while he lived, and for my daughter, Dawn, long after he was gone. I rose early, always before the Sunday. The air at 6 a.m. was cold enough to sting my cheeks, but I welcomed it. The kettle hissed, and I poured steaming water into that chipped mug I'd had since my wedding day. Its porcelain handle was hairline cracked, but I never replaced it. It had survived moves, lean winters, and the trembling grip of my late husband's hand when illness stole his strength. I would sit by the kitchen window with my coffee and look out at the violets he adored, their purple petals catching the first thin light. For 45 years, I gave everything I had to Dawn. Nights, I cleaned offices, fluorescent lights buzzing above my mop, my reflection a tired shadow in glass doors. Weekends, I baked cupcakes, selling them in the churchyard with hands dusted in flour and sugar. In between, I stitched hems and patched jeans, my sewing machine clicking into the early hours while neighbors slept. Every penny scraped together was for her. Tuition, books, a chance at a future I had never been offered. I remember her as a girl with ribbons in her hair, her smile wide enough to erase every exhaustion I carried. Each report card she brought home was a medal to me. Each laugh was a victory. I thought, if she can climb higher, all my bruised knees from scrubbing and bending will mean something. And they did, or so I believed. When Dawn married Dave, I swallowed my pride. He had a sharp tongue and eyes that roamed around my house as though he were calculating its square footage rather than appreciating its warmth. Still, I welcomed them every Sunday with a set table, the smell of roasted chicken or stew filling the air, candles lit even when money was tight. I smiled, always smiled, because I thought love demanded that I open my door no matter how cold his presence made the room. After my husband passed, I dreamed Dawn and I would grow closer, bound by grief and memory. Instead, I watched her visits turn into obligations. She called less, her voice thin on the phone, her words rehearsed. Excuses came like rain in November, predictable, endless. The girl who once clung to my skirts now carried herself as though I were a weight tied to her ankle. I should have noticed sooner the way her compliments vanished, replaced by silence or subtle sighs. I should have seen how Dave's shadow lengthened across her choices, how his disdain for me grew bolder, less hidden. But I wanted to believe my sacrifices had purchased not only her future but also her love. The first cracks showed themselves in moments small enough to dismiss if I had been less attentive, a dismissive glance when I asked about her work, a muttered word I wasn't meant to hear, clingy. A Sunday dinner she ended early, leaving my table still heavy with food and my heart light with uneaten joy. On one gray October day, I cooked her favorite meal, chicken and dumplings, the recipe perfected over years of practice. I laid out the embroidered tablecloth I had stitched when she was still a teenager. I bought fresh flowers, arranged them carefully, hoping for a smile that would bridge the distance. That night, instead of warmth, I received news that split my world apart. But that revelation belongs to another chapter. For now, I remember the quiet before the storm, the chipped mug, the violets, the sacrifices etched into calloused hands, and the daughter I believed I knew until I discovered how fragile memory can be when weighed against ambition and greed. Bạn có muốn mình viết tiếp Chương 3. The First Wounds of Daily Life. Cảnh mâu thuẫn đời thường bắt đầu rõ rệt. Bữa cơm, lời nói mỉa mai, cảm giác bị biến thành người giúp việc không? Bạn đã nói. Tiếp tục. ChatGPT đã nói. Chapter 3. The First Wounds of Daily Life. It began not with shouting or slammed doors, but with little cuts so small you almost tell yourself you imagined the sting. That was how my daughter and her husband first wounded me. Not with violence, not even with open cruelty, but with the steady erosion of dignity. One Sunday, Dawn arrived an hour late. I had kept the roast warm, the potatoes drying out in the oven, my hands chapped from scrubbing pots. When she walked in, her smile didn't reach her eyes. Dave didn't bother with pleasantries. He slumped into my late husband's chair, the one that still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco, and turned on the television. "What's for dinner?" he asked, without looking at me. It wasn't curiosity, it was command. I tried to smooth it over. I told myself, they're young, they're tired, marriage is heavy. But each week the pattern repeated. I cooked, I cleaned, I set the table like a shrine to family. They ate quickly, sometimes barely touched the food, then left without offering to wash a single dish. The clatter of their retreating footsteps always sounded louder than the silence they left behind. There were other moments, too. Dawn asking casually if I could watch their errands packages because they didn't trust the neighbors. Dave leaving his shirts in a pile on my sofa after a meal, saying, "You know how to get the collars really white, Mrs. Williams." He said it with the tone of someone assigning chores, not requesting help. And Dawn, my Dawn, just nodded, as if it were natural for me to scrub her husband's sweat out of his clothes. I told myself I didn't mind. Isn't that what mothers do? We sacrifice, we bend, we give, but every act of giving felt different now. No longer gratitude, only expectation. The house I had once filled with warmth was slowly turning into a place where I was staff, not family. The humiliation sharpened one afternoon when Dawn, looking at my old coat by the door, said, "Mom, maybe you should donate some of your things. They're so dated. We could get you something new." Her eyes flicked toward Dave, who smirked at my silence. The coat had been a gift from my husband, bought in the lean years when he had saved coins in a jar just so I wouldn't face winter with threadbare sleeves. Dated, that was her word for it. My memories, my sacrifices, my history dated. Still, I endured. I held my tongue. Because to protest would mean to admit how far she had drifted, and I wasn't ready for that truth. But then came the evening when I carried plates of steaming food to the table and caught the tail end of a sentence not meant for me. Dave, leaning close to Dawn, muttered, "Why do we keep coming here? It's like eating at a maid's house." Dawn didn't correct him. She didn't defend me. She just looked away. I froze, my hand trembling so badly the spoon clattered against the plate. I forced a smile, as though I hadn't heard. But inside, something broke a small, fragile piece of faith I'd carried for years. That night, after they left, I sat alone at the table, the dishes cooling around me, the embroidered tablecloth marked with crumbs. I stared at the empty chairs and thought of how easily love can be mistaken for servitude when the people you love decide your worth is less than their comfort. It was then, in the quiet ache of that evening, that I realized these were not accidents or slips of tongue. These were the first deliberate steps down a path I had not chosen. And though I didn't yet know it, the road ahead would lead not just to insults and indifference, but to betrayal so deep it would threaten to erase me from the very walls I had built with my life. The following weeks blurred together in a pattern I could no longer ignore. Sundays were no longer visits filled with laughter, the way they had been when Dawn was a girl running through the house barefoot, her voice echoing off the walls. They had become obligations, duties my daughter performed with the same weary tone she used for errands she resented. Her phone rarely left her hand, her eyes scrolling through messages while I set plates before her. She spoke in half answers, distracted, while Dave barked his preferences as though I were a waitress. "Less salt next time," he said after one meal, pushing away a dish I had spent hours preparing. "The meat's too dry." Another time without looking up. Not once did he thank me. "And Dawn?" She nodded, complicit in his dismissals. One evening, I tried to tell her about the violets in the window, the ones her father had loved, the ones blooming again despite the frost outside. I wanted to share a memory, something soft, something that tethered us to the man we had both lost. She barely glanced up from her phone. "That's nice, Mom," she murmured, her thumbs moving faster than her heart. The distance between us in that moment felt larger than the entire house. The small humiliations grew sharper. A basket of laundry left by the door, Dave's shirts, Dawn's dresses. "You always did it better than the cleaners," Dawn said casually, as if it were a compliment. The sting was not in the work I had washed clothes my whole life, but in the assumption that my time, my energy, my worth existed only for their convenience. Even my home, the place I had poured decades of sacrifice into, began to feel like it belonged less to me and more to them. Dave walked through rooms commenting on furniture, noting which pieces were outdated, suggesting where a bigger couch would fit. His eyes were always measuring, as though every square foot was already his. The worst came one gray Thursday. I had set the table with my embroidered cloth, the one Dawn herself had once admired as a teenager, running her fingers along its stitched flowers. That evening she sat across from me, her gaze cool. "Mom," she said, "have you thought about downsizing? This house is too big for you. It's not practical." Dave didn't even wait for my response. "A retirement community would be better, safer." I swallowed my protest, but the food on the table turned tasteless. I realized then that every gesture of care I had offered, every meal, every folded shirt, every quiet smile wasn't drawing us closer. It was pushing me further into a role I hadn't chosen, the burden, the caretaker, the relic. That night, after the dishes were washed and the silence thick in the empty house, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the photographs on the wall. Dawn as a child, blowing out candles. Dawn on her first day of school. Dawn in her graduation gown, my arm around her shoulders. In every photo, my smile was wide, unguarded, proud. How had those smiles become invisible to her? How had love been twisted into obligation, devotion into something disposable? I did not yet know the answer, but I felt, with the clarity of a knife pressing against skin, that something darker was coming. The little cuts were preparing me for a wound that would bleed deeper than I had ever imagined. "Bạn có muốn mình viết tiếp?" Chương 5. The day the floor gave way, biến cố thật sự xảy ra. Khi họ lộ rõ ý định muốn chiếm lấy căn nhà không? Bạn đã nói. Tiếp tục. ChatGPT đã nói. Chapter 5. The day the floor gave way. It was October, the kind of Thursday that pressed gray skies against the windows and made the house feel heavier than usual. I had spent the entire afternoon cooking chicken and dumplings, Dawn's favorite since childhood. The smell of simmering broth and soft dough filled the kitchen, and for a moment, I allowed myself to imagine her as a little girl again, perched on the counter with flour on her cheeks, laughing at my clumsy attempts to braid her hair. I laid the table carefully, spreading the embroidered cloth I had stitched during sleepless nights years ago. Fresh flowers, roses this time, stood proudly in the center, their petals soft and hopeful. I told myself tonight would be different. Tonight she would see me, not as an obligation, but as the mother who had given everything for her. The door opened without a knock. Dave strode in as if he owned the place, his coat slung over the arm of my late husband's chair before he dropped into it. He didn't say hello. He didn't look at me. The television flickered to life with the careless press of a button. The glow painted his face in cold light. Dawn followed, dressed in a green dress I had once bought her. Her beauty startled me, but the expression she wore detached, hurried, was a stranger's face. She sat down on the edge of the chair as if she were already halfway out the door. "Mom, we need to talk," she said. Her voice had changed since her marriage, sharper, clipped, as though every word cost her more than she wanted to pay. I forced a smile. "Dinner first? I made your favorite." Her eyes slid past the steaming plates. "Dave and I have made a decision." He didn't look up from the screen. His presence was enough to punctuate her sentence. "This house is too big for you," Dawn continued. "You can't maintain it alone anymore, and we need a bigger place, especially when we have kids." The words dropped like stones. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. This was the house where Dawn had taken her first steps, where her father had whispered promises of forever while holding my hand, where every corner held memories stitched tighter than the threads in my tablecloth. "But Dawn," I said softly, my voice cracking, "this is our home. Every picture on these walls tells our story. Every room carries your childhood." Her reply was colder than the October rain. "Memories are in the heart, Mom, not on the walls. Besides, the community we found has activities for people your age. You'll be better off there. You'll have company." Dave finally spoke, a smile tugging at his lips, smug and sharp. "It's for the best, Mrs. Williams. We'll take care of the paperwork. Don't worry about a thing." Paperwork. The words scraped against me like sandpaper. I felt the floor tilt beneath me, as though the house itself had shifted in protest. My knees weakened, but I stood tall, refusing to let them see me crumble. "I need time to think," I managed, gathering what little dignity I had left. "There's nothing to think about, Mom," Dawn said, standing abruptly. "It's already decided. The appraiser is coming next week." And just like that, they left. The door shut behind them, the echo bouncing off the walls like a cruel reminder. My carefully cooked dumplings sat untouched. The flowers wilted in their vase, as though even they had lost the will to stand. That night I sat at the table long after the food had gone cold, staring at the empty chairs where family should have been. My chest ached with betrayal, heavier than grief. For the first time, I allowed myself to whisper the truth I had avoided for months. I was no longer a mother in their eyes. I was an obstacle. And they had just told me, without shame, that they were ready to move me aside. The following week unfolded like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. I was still reeling from Dawn's words when the knock came at my door. Not a polite tap, but the firm rap of someone who already felt entitled to enter. When I opened it, Dave stood there with a stranger in a gray suit, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning my home as though it were nothing more than a transaction waiting to be signed. "This is the appraiser," Dave announced, stepping aside without asking permission. He walked in as though the threshold no longer belonged to me. Dawn trailed behind, her face set in a mask of polite detachment. The man barely acknowledged me. He moved through my rooms quickly, taking notes, tapping walls, muttering to himself. "Pipes are outdated. Roof will need replacing. These kitchen tiles are old-fashioned." Old-fashioned. Those tiles were laid by my husband's own hands when Dawn was 10. Each one had been placed with care, with the hope that the kitchen would be the heart of our family's life. To this man, they were just a problem, to be solved with money. To my daughter, they were something to be nodded at, dismissed, erased. I stood silently as they walked through the living room, past the photographs I had arranged in neat frames. Dawn's birthdays, her first school recital, our holidays together. The appraiser didn't glance at them. He was too busy measuring square footage. Dave's eyes followed him, lit with greed, as if every inch was already his prize. The final insult came when Dawn pulled brochures from her purse, her voice adopting a tone of false cheer. "Mom, look at these. The retirement community has beautiful gardens. They even have bingo on Tuesdays, and a nurse is always on duty. You'll be safe there." Safe. As if the home I had lived in for 30 years, where every neighbor knew me by name, where my husband's laughter still lingered in the walls, was unsafe. As if the memories stitched into every corner were dangerous clutter I needed to be rescued from. My throat tightened. I forced words past the lump. "Dawn, I've lived here all my life. I know every creak in these floors. I know which windows stick in the winter and which doors rattle in the wind. I know this house better than I know myself." She avoided my eyes. Dave, however, smiled with smug satisfaction. "You'll thank us one day. It's for the best." For the best. Whose best? Certainly not mine. I felt myself shrinking as they discussed timelines and signatures, their voices weaving a future where I no longer existed inside these walls. My presence was irrelevant. I was a shadow listening to strangers talk about dismantling my life. When they finally left, the silence in the house was unbearable. I walked slowly through each room, touching the furniture, the photographs, the curtains I had sewn with my own hands. Everything I touched reminded me of years of sacrifice and how easily it could all be dismissed as dated or too much for me to handle. That night, I sat in my husband's old chair, clutching one of the brochures until the edges bent under my grip. My heart hammered with humiliation. They weren't just planning to move me, they were planning to strip me of everything I had built. And for the first time, a thought whispered in my mind, chilling me to the bone. Maybe they already had a plan to take this house from me, long before I ever knew. The humiliation I had swallowed in silence soon turned into something far sharper, public shame. It was a Sunday evening, colder than most, when Dawn insisted we gather for dinner not in my home, but at hers. I arrived clutching a pie I had baked, the kind Dawn once begged for on her birthdays. My hands trembled around the warm dish, though I told myself it was just the chill outside. Inside, their dining room was filled with laughter. Friends of theirs, people I barely knew, sat around the long table. Glasses clinked, conversations overlapped, and the smell of roasted meat filled the air. For a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, this was an invitation to inclusion, a small chance to feel like family again. But the chair they offered me was not at the center, not even close. It was at the very end of the table, far from Dawn, far from conversation, squeezed between a drafty window and the swinging kitchen door. Dave gestured casually. "Sit here, Mrs. Williams. Easier for you to get up and help with the dishes later." The guests laughed softly, unsure if it was a joke. My cheeks burned. I set the pie down and folded my hands in my lap, forcing a smile that cracked at the edges. As plates were passed, I noticed something cruel in the small details. Dawn had served everyone generous portions of the main dish, but when the platter reached me, it was nearly empty. Dave smirked. "Sorry, Mom. Should have gotten in line earlier." More laughter. My daughter said nothing. I tried to eat in silence, though every bite lodged in my throat like stone. Conversation flowed around me, work promotions, new cars, future vacations. I had nothing to add. When I finally spoke, offering a memory of Dawn's childhood, she cut me off with a sharp glance. "Mom, not now." The dismissal sliced clean through me. It was near the end of the meal when Dave raised his glass. "Here's to new beginnings," he announced, "and to making practical decisions for the future. Some of us need to learn that clinging to the past only drags everyone else down." Eyes turned toward me, subtle but undeniable. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. One woman cleared her throat. Dawn avoided my gaze, staring into her wine. I felt the walls tilt again, the same way they had when they first told me about the retirement community. My face burned, my palms damp against my skirt. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, but the words tangled in my throat. Then, Dave added the final cruelty. "After all, what's the point of holding on to a big old house when you can't even take care of yourself? Better to let the younger generation make use of it. Isn't that right, Mom?" The word "Mom" rolled off his tongue like an insult, stripped of tenderness. The table was silent. Everyone waited for me to answer. I swallowed, forcing myself to hold my posture, though my heart hammered against my ribs. "This house you speak of," I said softly, "was built on sacrifice. On nights I worked instead of slept. On love I gave without question." My voice cracked, but I didn't let it fall. "If that makes me a burden, then perhaps I was a burden the day I gave birth to the daughter who now forgets what it cost me." No one spoke. The silence was louder than any laughter. Dawn's face tightened, her cheeks flushed. "That's enough, Mom," she hissed, her voice like ice. "Don't embarrass yourself." But it was too late. I already was. I lowered my eyes, staring at the empty plate before me. For the first time, I understood that the shame wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. They wanted me small, humiliated, compliant. They wanted me to disappear. And that night, as I walked home under the cold streetlights, the pie dish heavy and empty in my hands, I realized something even darker. Shame was only the beginning. They were preparing the world to see me as useless, so that when they finally took everything, no one would question it. It was late November when I first felt what it meant to be invisible in my own life. The wind cut sharp through the bare trees, rattling branches against the windows like fingers demanding entry. I had gone to the market early that morning, clutching a small list: bread, milk, and flour for the dumplings Dawn once loved but no longer touched. My coat was buttoned tight, my scarf tucked beneath my chin, and I thought of nothing except returning to the quiet safety of my home. When I reached the front door, the key refused to turn. I tried again, jiggling it in the lock, my hands stiff from the cold. The metal scraped, but the door held firm. Confused, I bent closer, my breath fogging the brass. And then I saw it, the tiny gleam of a new lock, one I had not paid for, one I had never agreed to. I knocked, at first lightly, then harder. My fist thudded against the wood until the sound bruised my bones. From inside, footsteps approached. The door opened just a crack, and there stood Dave, his face a mask of false politeness. "Oh, Mrs. Williams," he said, as if speaking to a stranger. "We changed the locks this morning. Safety precautions. You should have received a call." I stared at him, stunned. "This is my house." He shrugged, leaning casually against the frame. "Technically, it's in the process of becoming ours. The lawyer said it's best to get things ready. You can stay with Dawn tonight at the apartment. More comfortable for you anyway." Behind him, I saw my daughter standing at the foot of the stairs, arms crossed, her eyes avoiding mine. She said nothing, not a single word. I pressed my palm against the door, as though the wood itself might recognize me when my family did not. "This is where your father and I built our lives," I whispered. "This is where I raised you, Dawn. How dare you lock me out?" Dave's smirk widened. "Let's not make a scene. The neighbors don't need to see this. You'll be better off once the paperwork's settled. Trust us." The words landed like a shove, and before I could reply, the door shut in my face. The click of the lock echoed in the cold air, final and cruel. I stood there, trembling, the grocery bag cutting into my arm, bread growing cold against my side. Neighbors passed on the sidewalk, their glances quick, uncomfortable, as though they had stumbled upon something indecent but didn't dare intervene. I forced myself to walk away, each step heavier than the last. That night I slept in a borrowed chair at a neighbor's house, my body stiff, my pride broken. I stared at the ceiling until dawn, asking myself the same question over and over. How had love twisted into this? How had my own child allowed me to be treated like an intruder in the only home I had ever known? But even in the depths of that humiliation, something stubborn flickered inside me. I was not yet ready to surrender. I would not vanish quietly. And though I didn't know it then, the locks on my door were just the beginning. Far worse betrayals were waiting, coiled and patient, ready to strike. It was the first Sunday of Advent, a time I had always cherished, candles lit, hymns humming faintly on the radio, the scent of cinnamon and cloves warming the air. I carried a basket of cookies I had baked, simple ones dusted with powdered sugar, hoping to bridge the growing distance with sweetness. When I arrived at Dawn's apartment, I noticed at once that the gathering was larger than usual. Friends of theirs crowded the living room, their laughter spilling out into the hallway. I hesitated at the door, cookies balanced carefully in my hands, my heart fluttering like a nervous bird. Inside, Dawn offered me only a thin smile. "Mom, you made it," she said, her tone flat, her eyes sliding quickly to Dave, who was pouring drinks like a host in his own kingdom. I set the basket on the counter, invisible among the trays of catered food that gleamed under plastic lids. No one reached for my cookies. We gathered around the table. My seat was again at the far end, near the window draught, a familiar exile. I listened quietly as conversations rose and fell around me. Vacation plans, new promotions, baby names for children not yet conceived. No one asked me about my week, my health, or my thoughts. I was a shadow, tolerated but not welcomed. Then it came. Dave, raising his glass with theatrical flourish, declared, "Here's to the future, building families, securing homes, making smart decisions." His eyes found me, a glint of cruelty barely hidden, and to knowing when it's time to step aside so the next generation doesn't have to carry burdens. The word landed like a slap. Burden. A label heavy enough to crush the decades of sacrifice I had poured into Dawn's life. Around the table, a few people chuckled politely, not sure if it was truly a joke. My daughter lowered her gaze, her cheeks pink with something that looked like shame, but she said nothing. I felt my breath catch, sharp as broken glass. My hands trembled under the table, clutching the napkin until it tore. For a moment, I thought I might stand, scream, demand they recognize who I was. But the weight of all those eyes pressed me down. Instead, I forced a smile so brittle it could have shattered with the next breath. A guest tried to change the subject, but the damage was done. The laughter, the silence that followed, the clink of glasses, it all wrapped around me like chains. For the rest of the evening, I tasted only bitterness. My cookies sat untouched, the powdered sugar melting into a forgotten dust. When the night ended, I carried the basket back with me, heavier than when I arrived. Each step home echoed with the word Dave had given me burden. It followed me up the stairs, into the quiet of my bedroom, into the dreams that would not let me rest. That night I realized something terrible. Once someone names you a burden, it is only a matter of time before they begin treating you as disposable. And though I didn't yet know how far they were willing to go, the answer was already on its way to my doorstep. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the knock came again. Not the gentle tap of a neighbor or the polite rhythm of a deliveryman, but the insistent pounding of someone who already believed they had authority over me. When I opened the door, Dave stood tall, his posture brimming with arrogance. Dawn was beside him, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Behind them, a man in a dark suit carried a leather briefcase. His smile was practiced, professional, the kind lawyers wear when they're about to dismantle a life under the guise of helping. "Mrs. Williams," the man said smoothly, "we just need a few signatures today. Routine paperwork." I frowned. Paperwork for what? Dawn shifted uncomfortably, but Dave's voice filled the silence. "For the transfer of the property. We've decided it's best for the family to keep the house under our name. It's safer that way, Mom. Less complicated." The words scraped against my ears like knives. Transfer. Under our name. My stomach lurched. I clutched the edge of the doorframe to steady myself. "I thought you were going to sell the house," I whispered, more to Dawn than to him. She avoided my gaze, her lips pressed into a thin line. Dave smiled that smug, rehearsed smile. "Plans change. We realized it's better for everyone if the property stays in the family. We'll take care of everything. All you need to do is sign." The lawyer opened his briefcase, pulling out thick documents stamped with official seals. He slid them across my dining table as if this were already his office. I stood frozen, my eyes darting over the unfamiliar language, the dense paragraphs of legal jargon. The words blurred, but one sentence pierced through: transfer of ownership. My heart pounded. My breath came shallow. I looked at my daughter, searching desperately for some sign of hesitation, some flicker of love, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. She stared at the tablecloth I had embroidered, the same one she used to admire, now just fabric beneath the weight of betrayal. "I'm not signing anything," I said, my voice trembling but firm. Dave's smile faltered, his tone hardened. "Mom, don't make this harder than it has to be. You're not in a position to live here alone. Dawn is your heir. She's acting in your best interest." "My best interest?" My voice rose, surprising even myself. "This is my house. The walls still remember your father's laughter. The floors still echo with your first steps. Dawn, you want me to erase all of that with a signature?" The lawyer cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Ma'am, if you refuse, there are other legal options. A proceeding for incapacity, for example." Incapacity. The word cut through me like a blade. My own daughter, the child I had carried, the one I had fed and clothed and sacrificed for, was willing to have me declared incompetent just to steal the home her father and I had built. My knees wavered, but I did not fall. I pressed my palm flat on the table, leaning forward. "Get out," I whispered. "All of you. Get out of my house." Dave leaned closer, his voice low, threatening. "You have 1 week, old woman. Either you sign, or we'll make sure you don't have a choice." When the door finally slammed shut behind them, I collapsed into my husband's armchair. For the first time since his funeral, I wept openly, great racking sobs that shook my body. I cried not only for the home they wanted to take, but for the daughter I had already lost. But somewhere beneath the grief, a spark flickered, a refusal to vanish quietly. They wanted me erased. They wanted me silenced. They thought my age, my solitude, my grief made me weak. They had no idea how strong a mother becomes when the only thing left to defend is the dignity she's built with her entire life. The night after they shoved those papers across my table, I barely slept. My eyes burned from crying, my chest ached from holding grief too tightly, and the silence of the house felt heavier than stone. I wandered from room to room like a ghost, touching the walls, the curtains, the photographs, reminding myself that these things still belonged to me, at least for now. In the living room, my husband's old armchair sat waiting, worn smooth by years of his presence. I sank into it and felt the ache of absence sharpen. If only he were here, I thought. He would have known what to do. He always did. He had been the calm to my storm, the steady hand that built not only our home, but the future we once dreamed for our daughter. Restless, I rose and moved toward his desk. It had been years since I opened its drawers. After his passing, I couldn't bring myself to disturb the order he had left behind. Bills neatly stacked, envelopes carefully labeled, pens lined in a row. He had always been precise, deliberate, a man who believed in leaving things exactly where they belonged. I ran my fingers along the edge of the top drawer, hesitating. Then, with a shaky breath, I pulled it open. Receipts, letters, old notes, familiar things, unremarkable. But deeper inside, beneath faded photographs and utility bills, I found a folder I had never seen before. It was marked with his initials WH and fastened with a small brass lock. My hands trembled as I held it. Why had he hidden this? Why had he never told me? I searched the desk drawers for a key, finding nothing. Then I remembered, my husband often tucked important things inside his books. I moved to the shelves, my fingers tracing spines worn with age. At last, inside an old volume on investments, a key glinted between the pages. My breath caught. I unlocked the folder. The hinges creaked softly, as if even the paper knew it carried secrets. Inside were documents, bank statements, deeds, certificates, all meticulously arranged. My eyes darted over words I barely understood, numbers so large they seemed impossible. And then, at the very bottom, a will. It was dated 6 months before my husband's death. My heart raced as I unfolded the paper, reading line by line. He had left everything to me, not just the house. Not just the modest pension I had always assumed was all we had, but properties, shares in companies, investments I never knew existed, and then came the clause that made my blood run cold. Dawn would inherit only if she cared for me with love and respect until my final days. If she mistreated me, if she betrayed me, her inheritance would vanish like smoke. Tears spilled down my cheeks, blurring the ink. My husband, quiet, careful, always watching, had seen what I had refused to see. He had doubted Dave. He had feared what greed could do. And he had built a shield for me long before I knew I would need one. At the very back of the folder lay a letter, handwritten in his familiar script. "My dearest Maeve," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I am no longer there to hold your hand. Forgive me for keeping this from you, but I wanted you to discover it when you needed it most. You gave your life to us, to Dawn and me. I wanted to give something back away to protect you, even when I could not stand beside you. Remember this, you are stronger than you know. And if Dawn ever forgets the mother who made her, you will have the power to remind her. Not to hurt her, but to teach her. Not to destroy, but to protect." I clutched the letter to my chest, sobbing into the night. For the first time in months, my tears were not only of despair but of relief. My husband had seen me. He had prepared for this betrayal. They thought I was powerless. They thought I was a frail old woman with nothing left to fight with but memories. But in my hands, I now held proof of a truth that would change everything. My hands shook so violently I could barely keep the papers steady. I laid them across the dining table, the same table where Dawn once spread her homework, where we blew out birthday candles, where Dave now lounged as though it were his throne. Under the yellow glow of the lamp, the documents gleamed with truths I had never suspected. The will was clear, painfully clear. My husband, quiet and deliberate in life, had built something vast in secret. Every late hour he spent at the office, every modest answer he gave when I asked about money, every careful smile now I understood. He had been weaving a net of protection, one he never told me about because he feared my worry, or perhaps because he wanted to surprise me when the years grew heavy. He had invested in small properties decades ago, when prices were low. He had bought stocks in companies I'd only vaguely heard of, names that now carried weight and wealth. He had purchased land on the outskirts of the city, a piece of earth that had since grown in value like gold hidden beneath dust. I whispered each line aloud as if saying it could make it real. Bank accounts, shares, real estate, an empire, carefully hidden beneath the life of a man I thought was ordinary. But the line that struck deepest was not about money. It was about love and betrayal. To my beloved wife, Maeve, it read, "I leave all that I have, with the trust that she will continue to live in dignity. To my daughter, Dawn, I leave only this. If she cares for her mother with love and respect until her final breath, she may inherit a portion as written in Appendix B. If she fails in this duty, her inheritance is void. All will remain with my wife, to do with as she sees fit." My breath caught. It was as though he had written this with today in mind, with Dave's cold smirk and Dawn's downcast eyes already haunting his thoughts. He had foreseen what I had refused to see. At the back of the will, I found a sealed envelope. I tore it open carefully, the paper fragile, the ink slightly faded. It was a letter, his handwriting unmistakable. "My dearest Maeve, if Dawn ever turns against you, if she forgets the sacrifices that raised her, remember this, you are not powerless. I have built this so you may stand tall when others try to bend you. Do not let greed erase your dignity. Use what I've left not for revenge, but for protection and for teaching. Even in her worst moments, Dawn is still our daughter. Perhaps one day she will see clearly again. But until then, do not be afraid to defend yourself. With all my love, your husband." I pressed the letter to my chest, tears soaking the page. For months I had felt cornered, stripped of everything. But in that moment, power returned, not the kind Dave flaunted, loud and arrogant, but quiet power, rooted in truth, in preparation, in love. I realized then that the fight ahead was not just about saving a house, it was about saving myself from erasure, from humiliation, from the lie that I was nothing more than a burden. And if Dawn and Dave thought they had broken me, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The following Sunday, I sat at the kitchen table long before the clock struck noon. The documents lay in a neat pile before me, weighted down by my chipped mug of tea. The steam curled into the air like a secret too heavy to stay hidden. I had read the will so many times by then that the words were etched into me, carved deeper than memory. My husband had left me not only wealth, but a weapon one forged from foresight and love. When the door opened, I didn't rise to greet them. Dave swaggered in first, his eyes sweeping across the room like a man inspecting his property. Dawn followed, her shoulders tight, her face pale. "Mom," she said, setting her purse down with a sharp thud. "We need to settle this today. The lawyer will be back tomorrow for your signature." Dave leaned against the wall, arms folded, a smirk tugging at his mouth. "The sooner you accept this, the easier it will be for everyone." I stayed seated, my hand resting on the folder. My heart pounded, but my voice was calm. "Funny thing," I said softly. "I found something last night, something your father left for me." Dawn frowned. "What do you mean?" I slid a single document across the table, just enough for them to see the letterhead and the date. Not everything just enough. Dave's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing. "What is this?" "It's proof," I replied. "Proof that this house is not yours to take. Proof that everything this home, and more than you can imagine, belongs to me, and me alone." Dawn reached for the paper, her hands trembling. She scanned the lines, her lips moving silently as she read, her face drained of color. "This can't be." "It is," I interrupted, my voice steady. "Your father saw through all of this long before I did. He left safeguards, he left power, and he left me the choice of what to do with it." Dave snatched the paper from her, reading quickly, his jaw tightening with every line. "This doesn't change anything," he snapped. "You're old. You're fragile. Courts won't listen to you. We'll contest it. We'll prove you're not capable of managing anything." I leaned forward, meeting his eyes directly for the first time in years. "Try it. See what happens when the truth comes out. See how far your lies get you when faced with evidence." The silence between us was sharp, electric. Dawn's eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing. Dave's fists clenched at his sides, the mask of arrogance slipping to reveal the rage beneath. For the first time, I wasn't the one shrinking in this house. I wasn't the one trembling. It was them. I sat back, folding my husband's letter gently, sliding it back into the folder. "Leave," I said quietly. "Come back when you remember what it means to be family." Neither of them moved at first. Then, with a harsh scrape of his chair, Dave stormed out, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. Dawn lingered in the doorway. Her lips parted as though she might speak, but no words came, only silence. Then she turned and followed him. When the echo of their departure finally faded, I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The storm had begun, and I was standing in the very center of it. But this time I was not afraid. The days that followed were a blur of silence and waiting. I thought perhaps Dawn would come back alone, knock timidly at my door, and whisper some fragment of the daughter I once knew. I clung to that fragile hope like a lifeline. But when the knock finally came, it wasn't timid at all. It was sharp, insistent, a demand. I opened the door to find them both standing there, Dawn with red-rimmed eyes, Dave with his jaw set in stone. For a brief second, I thought she had come to apologize. Then I saw the papers in her hand. "Mom," she said, her voice strained but steady, "I need you to sign these. Today." My heart dropped. "Dawn, it's for your own good," she cut me off, not meeting my eyes. "Dave and I have talked to a lawyer. If you don't cooperate, they'll have to declare you unfit. It will be easier this way." The words burned through me like fire. Unfit. My own daughter, the one I had carried, fed, clothed, and prayed over, was standing on my porch threatening to erase me with ink and signatures. "Do you even hear yourself?" I asked, my voice trembling with rage. "Do you realize what you're doing?" She swallowed hard, her gaze flickering toward Dave. He gave the smallest nod, and with that, she straightened her shoulders. "I'm doing what's best for us for the family. You can't live alone anymore. You'll be happier in the community. Happier." The word tasted bitter. I turned to Dave. "This is your voice coming out of her mouth. You've poisoned her." He didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped closer, his tone low and dangerous. "Face it, old woman. You've had your time. This house is wasted on you. Dawn finally understands that." And then my daughter, my flesh and blood nodded. The sound of that small gesture broke something inside me more violently than any insult could. It was the twist of betrayal I had feared but never truly believed would come. She had chosen him, not me. Not the years of sacrifice, not the memories carved into these walls. Him. I backed away, my hand pressed against the table to steady myself. "Do you remember who sat up all night sewing your prom dress because we couldn't afford the one you wanted? Do you remember who skipped meals so you could eat? Do you remember who stood in the rain outside your college exams praying for you?" My voice cracked, but I forced the words out. "And this is what you give me in return?" For the briefest flicker of a moment, I saw her lips tremble. A tear threatened to spill. But then Dave placed his hand firmly on her shoulder, and the weakness vanished. "We're done arguing," he said coldly. "You have one more chance. Sign, or we'll let the court decide." Dawn's voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut me deeper than any scream. "Please, Mom, don't fight us." I stared at her, at the daughter I had raised, the woman I no longer recognized, and in that moment, the last fragile thread binding us together snapped. The betrayal was complete. The words echoed in my skull. "Please, Mom, don't fight us." As if surrendering my home, my memories, and my very identity was the kindest thing I could do. My knees weakened, but I clutched the edge of the table until my knuckles burned white. For months I had endured humiliation in silence. I had swallowed insults, forced smiles, and bent my back until it nearly broke. But at that moment, something inside me snapped. I slammed my palm against the table so hard the teacup rattled and cracked, spilling amber liquid across the embroidered cloth. Both of them jumped. My voice, hoarse from years of restraint, erupted with a force I didn't know I still possessed. "Enough!" I roared. The sound startled even me. It came from a place buried so deep that grief and sacrifice had almost smothered it. My chest heaved, my heart pounding like a drum too big for its cage. "I am not a burden. I am not your problem to fix. This is my house, built with my blood, my sweat, my husband's love, and you will not take it from me." Tears spilled hot down my cheeks, but I did not hide them. My hands trembled, my voice cracked, but every word cut through the air sharper than glass. "Do you think I scrubbed floors at midnight and baked cupcakes at dawn so you could stand here and call me useless? Do you think I gave up my youth, my health, my dreams, so my own child could betray me with a signature?" Dawn's lips parted, but no words came. Her eyes shimmered with tears, her face pale. For a moment, the girl I once knew flickered behind her hardened mask. Dave sneered, but there was unease in his eyes. "You're hysterical, old woman. Sit down before you hurt yourself." I turned to him, every muscle in my body trembling with fury. "Do not speak to me like I am your servant. You have taken enough from me. My daughter's loyalty, my peace, my dignity. You will not take my home." The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with my ragged breath. My vision blurred with tears, yet everything felt sharper than it ever had. I was trembling, my heart pounding so violently I could feel it in my fingertips, but I stood tall, taller than I had in years. "I would rather die on these floors than watch you steal them from me," I cried, my voice breaking into a sob. Silence followed, heavy and raw. Dawn pressed her hands to her face, sobbing quietly, but she did not step toward me. Dave's jaw clenched, his smirk had vanished. For the first time, he looked unsure, and I stood there, chest heaving, hands shaking, tears running freely, but unbroken. It was the breaking point, the moment when pain and humiliation burned away, leaving only the raw steel of survival. Whether they saw it or not, whether they cared or not, I was no longer the fragile woman they thought they could erase. I was a mother betrayed, a widow armed with truth, and I would not go quietly. When the last echo of my voice faded, the house felt strangely hollow, as though the walls themselves were stunned into silence. Dawn sat slumped at the edge of a chair, her hands covering her face. Dave stood rigid, his fists clenched, but he didn't speak. For once, his arrogance had no words. Finally, he grabbed Dawn's arm and pulled her toward the door. She resisted for a heartbeat, her eyes flicking back to me with something unreadable guilt. Sorrow, maybe even fear, but she allowed him to lead her out. The slam of the door reverberated through the rooms like a gunshot. Then there was nothing. Only me, the spilled tea staining my embroidered tablecloth, and the echo of my own ragged breathing. I sank slowly into my husband's old armchair, my body trembling from the storm that had ripped through me. My chest still ached, each heartbeat sharp, as if my heart itself had cracked under the weight of betrayal. For the first time in years I had screamed, demanded, fought. And now that the fury had drained away, all that remained was emptiness. The house was mine, yet it no longer felt like home. Every corner held memories, but they were stained now, tainted by the image of my daughter standing on my doorstep, siding with the man who despised me. The photographs on the walls, Dawn as a child on her first day of school, her graduation, her wedding looked down at me like accusations. I had given everything, and somehow it had led here. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in my bed. I curled up in the armchair, clutching my husband's letter to my chest. His words were both comfort and wound, not to hurt, but to protect, not to destroy, but to teach. I whispered them into the darkness until the tears dried on my cheeks. In the days that followed, the silence grew heavier. Dawn didn't call. Dave didn't return. The neighbors glanced at me with pity when I fetched the mail, their eyes full of questions they were too afraid to ask. I walked the room slowly, touching the furniture, the curtains, the very walls, as if to reassure myself that I still belonged here. And yet, beneath the grief, a strange calm began to take root. I had reached my breaking point and survived. I had faced their betrayal, their cruelty, their shameless hunger for what was mine, and I had not collapsed. The emptiness remained, but it no longer felt like surrender. It felt like the quiet before a decision. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. I didn't know if Dawn would ever look me in the eye again, or if Dave would come back with more threats. But I knew this: I would not be erased. Even if the price was loneliness, I would rather sit alone in my broken house, clutching my dignity, than let them strip me of everything I had built. And so, in the silence of that aftermath, with the scent of cold tea still lingering in the air, I found the smallest ember of peace. Not joy, not forgiveness, but peace in the knowledge that I had finally stood for myself, and that, perhaps, was the beginning of whatever came next. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. Winter pressed itself against the windows, and the house seemed to creak beneath the weight of silence. I moved through the rooms like a shadow, tidying, dusting, keeping alive rituals that once made sense in a home filled with laughter. Now they were only habits, fragile defenses against the emptiness that followed me from dawn until dusk. Sometimes I sat at the dining table, staring at the tea-stained embroidery, my fingers tracing the faded threads as though they could stitch my life back together. Other times I wandered the garden, brittle leaves crunching beneath my shoes, the violets clinging to life despite the frost. My husband's letter stayed close, folded in my pocket, a whisper of his presence in a world that had grown so unbearably quiet. Dawn never returned. Not a knock at the door, not a phone call, not even a message slipped into the mailbox. Whether it was shame or defiance that kept her away, I did not know. And Dave, his shadow, lingered in my mind, a constant reminder that greed rarely sleeps. I half expected him to reappear with new threats, new papers, new ways to remind me that to him I was just an obstacle. And yet, the house still stood. My name still echoed in its deeds. My memories still lived in its walls. No signature had erased me. Not yet. At night, I sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker across the pavement. Families passed by, children's laughter rising into the dark, footsteps crunching in the snow. I wondered if any of them could see me there, an old woman in a dimly lit room, clutching a chipped mug and the ghost of a family that had once been her whole world. Sometimes I asked myself aloud, was I a fool for giving so much? Or is this simply what love costs in the end? I had no answer. The phone sat silent on the table, though I still caught myself glancing at it, waiting for a call that never came. Would Dawn ever come back, not with papers, not with demands, but with the voice of the girl who once called me her hero? Or had I lost her forever, swallowed whole by a man's ambition and her own blindness? I may never know. So I sit here now, in the home I built, surrounded by echoes of what was and shadows of what might be. The future is unwritten, my story unresolved. Perhaps tomorrow brings reconciliation. Perhaps it brings another battle. Perhaps it brings only more silence. But one truth remains. I am still here. Not erased, not forgotten, not yet. And I wonder when my daughter remembers me one day, will she recall the mother who gave her everything, or only the burden she thought she cast aside? That answer, like the ending of this story, belongs not to me, but to time.